Chapter 2. Douglas awoke the following morning to the sound of a cock crowing. It was, once again, a beautiful morning. Because his uncle had loosened the large window latch the day before, Douglas didn't find it difficult to unfasten the latch, allowing the huge glass pane to just slide open and let the crisp morning air waft into the room. The only sounds that could be heard above the hillside were the chirping of birds and the intermittent crowing of a rooster, which seemed to come from somewhere above where he stood. From above? How very odd, thought Douglas. But it was certainly not his imagination, for sure enough, every time the crowing began, he became more convinced that the sound was coming from the top of the dome. But how was that possible? A rooster on top of such a high tower? How on earth did he get up there? Eventually, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Douglas stuck his head through the open window. Craning his neck, he was just able to see the tip of the old weathercock. But besides this, he could see absolutely nothing else. Suddenly, a thought popped into his head, but no, come on, it couldn't be possible. How on earth can a rusty iron weathercock crow like a living bird? Douglas asked himself incredulously. Very easily, replied a strange, high-pitched voice. I've been doing it for years. Douglas bumped his head on the window ledge and went a little pale. Who said that? He yelled, already knowing the answer to his question, but finding it difficult to believe. There was a loud, and then the voice spoke again. The objects on top of the dome, number 3. The first is an iron rod pointing to the sky. The second is a cross on which directions lie. And the third, and highest of all, is me. Is it possible that you can speak, Weathercock? Exclaimed Douglas, astonished. Firstly, that's Mr. Weathercock, retorted the voice. And secondly, how I speak is none of your business, you nosy little boy. No need to be so rude, replied Douglas indignantly. But I think I can understand why you're grumpy. I suppose I would be too if I had to stay on top of a tower day in and day out, slowly rusting away, and being far too old to do anything but crow every morning. Are you implying I've lost my forecast skills? Screeched the weathercock furiously. Well, go on then, prove me wrong, Douglas challenged. Tell me what the weather is going to be like today. All right, I'll give you a display of my forecasting skills, you little brat, shrieked the enraged rooster. Suddenly, a huge clap of thunder tipped through the tranquility of the morning, and Douglas discovered, to his amazement and horror, that a single, large, pitch-black cloud had appeared out of nowhere and hung ominously above the house. You can imagine how strange this was, for the sky had been cloudless a moment before, and in fact was still cloudless everywhere else, except above the hill where the storm cloud flashed and rumbled angrily. How about a little rain for a nice sunny day? Said the weathercock. With these words, the cloud let out another thunderous rumble, and soon Douglas could hear the sound of heavy raindrops on the domed roof above him. In a matter of seconds, the pitter-patter had become a pounding torrent. Douglas had to close the window as fast as he could to prevent the room from being flooded. The pounding of the rain did not, however, drown out the strange cackling of the weathercock, who was becoming more and more delighted with each flash of lightning. Lost my forecast skills. He cackled. When I say it's going to rain, it rains buckets. There was a loud crash, and another, and then another. Staring out the window in total disbelief, Douglas discovered that the storm had heeded the weathercock's words literally, for steel buckets of all sizes to fall down from the clouds. Soon hundreds of them were crashing onto the house and the hillside, creating an absolutely deafening clatter. When I say it's going to rain, it rains buckets and pitchforks, screeched the weathercock. Soon the sky above the hill was filled with buckets and long, sharp pitchforks, which began to dash down and impale the hillside. "And rocking chairs and alarm clocks," continued the weathercock hysterically. His commands were obeyed by the cloud. The hillside was now becoming littered with splintered wood and the faces of broken alarm clocks, while the sound of crashing furniture and the loud clanging of hundreds of falling timepieces joined in with the clatter of smashing buckets and pitchforks. Still continued to rain down in great abundance. "And china plates," exclaimed the weathercock. "Smash, crash. And tennis balls, boing, boing. And cream pies, plop, plop." The irrational bird continued, with the cloud complying, of course. "And toothpaste tubes, boing, squish, thud. And pencil sharpeners and top hats." "Isn't this simply incredible?" whispered Montgomery Jones, who had slipped into the room unnoticed. But seeing the look of anguish on his nephew's face, he added quickly, "Don't worry, Daddy. I think I've just the thing to give the old weathercock a taste of his own medicine. Just watch this." The weathercock had obviously not heard what Montgomery Jones had whispered to Douglas, for it continued to add a profusion of unlikely objects to the frightful muddle already raining down on the hillside. "And corkscrews, bottle tops and ink tops," the bird rambled on. "And magnets," suggested Montgomery Jones, quite suddenly. "Oh, yes, and magnets," agreed the rooster, with an insane giggle. "And cucumbers." Suddenly, the weathercock produced a strange, muffled crow that sounded something like cock-a-doodle. Then it yelled, "Help! I'm too heavy. I'm going to fall. I'm going to fall." A moment later, the iron bird, his body plastered with about a dozen large magnets, which had a dozen steel buckets sticking firmly to them, plummeted down past the window. Douglas just watched, open-mouthed, as the clump of metal hit the ground and rolled noisily down the hill. The extra weight of all those magnets and buckets had pulled the unfortunate bird right off its perch. With the weathercock gone from the top of the tower, the weird storm it had created promptly ended. And like a giant vacuum cleaner, the cloud began to suck up all that fallen from it. Soon, everything, from the last bucket to the tiniest dab of cream, had disappeared from the hill. Then, with one last thunderclap, the cloud vanished into thin air, leaving no proof at all that it ever existed, except, of course, for an old, rather battered weathercock, lying at the foot of the hill. "Well, I have to say I'm quite shocked," said Montgomery Jones, when everything had settled down. "I'm terribly sorry, Uncle Montgomery. I really didn't mean to cause such a mess. You see, Don't be silly, Douglas," his uncle interrupted with a laugh. "I wasn't referring to your behaviour in any way. Why, you behaved quite admirably under the circumstances. In fact, you were responsible for exposing the weathercock's hidden powers." You mean you didn't know that it could crow and speak like that, Uncle Monty?" asked Douglas, astonished. "Oh, yes, I know about the speaking and the crowing. It's been doing that for years. But, I never would have imagined for one moment that it had the ability to create such a fiasco. It's quite extraordinary, wouldn't you say?" "Well, that's putting it mildly," Douglas agreed. Then, of course," continued Uncle Montgomery, "the question is whether Mr. Weathercock has been hiding his magical capabilities from me all this time, or whether he has acquired them recently. If he's acquired them recently, or has even had his magical powers increased over the years, little by little, it's very good news for us." "Why?" asked Douglas, puzzled. "Well, it's really quite simple. If the weathercock, which incidentally was not part of the enchanted castle, has acquired more magical powers than it originally had when it was first put on top of the dome, the implication is that the magic in this house is spreading. And that means the world of fantasy is becoming, more and more accessible. Yes, indeed. A most wonderful turn of events. And we must therefore set to work immediately on my latest and greatest project, something that I actually postponed when I received news that you were coming to visit. Well, what is it? Exclaimed Douglas. All should be revealed after breakfast, replied Montgomery, beaming from ear to ear. So hurry up. When you're ready, meet me in the kitchen. Don't be long, huh? See you soon, huh? Naturally, Douglas' curiosity got the better of him, so it didn't take him long to get dressed and gulp down his breakfast. Soon he was following his uncle again down the long passage with the numerous locked doors. On about halfway, Montgomery Jones paused, taking out a huge bunch of keys from a trouser pocket, promptly opened the door nearest to him with an energetic push. This is the assembly room, Dougie. It's where I generally construct all my projects, announced Montgomery Jones proudly, as he led his nephew into the large room that smelled of wet paint and sawdust, and was filled with spanners, screwdrivers, hammers, chisels, vices, files, and a multitude of other tools. In fact, he continued, this is one of the few rooms in this part of the house that is not stacked to the ceiling with wonderful rubbish. Well, you certainly have an incredible amount of equipment, Douglas shared. Everything I need, my boy, his uncle replied with a chuckle. But more importantly, have a look at the workbench and tell me what you see. The workbench, of course, and the tablecloth. Tablecloth? Exclaimed Uncle Montgomery. Why on earth would I have a tablecloth on my workbench? No, Doctor, that's not a tablecloth. It's a Persian carpet. How did you make it, Uncle? Make it? Good grief, I didn't make it, my boy. I simply took it. I took it from my study. There are plenty of them about the house. All very old, of course. But then, what exactly is it doing in your workshop? Asked Douglas, puzzled. Well, with a bit of luck, replied his uncle triumphantly, I've converted this carpet into a flying one. With this spectacular announcement, Montgomery Jones leapt towards the workbench and pulled the Persian carpet off the top of the table to reveal what had been concealed beneath it all along, a strange and most intriguing contraption. It consisted of a large, flat, rectangular body resembling a giant tea tray. However, attached to the sides of this flat section, which incidentally was as large as a medium-sized table, but two slender rockets. The giant tray also had handles secured to it and a number of thick belts, as well as a large lever resembling a car's gear shift that protruded conspicuously from one of its ends. Well, Dougie, what do you think of this then, Montgomery Jones asked with a huge grin. Well, it's amazing. Are those rockets the real thing? Marveled Douglas. They most certainly are. It took me months to construct them, replied his uncle proudly. Well, that's really incredible. But how does it work? Well, it is quite simple, actually, explained the little man. You see, the carpet fits on this flat part over here, he continued, indicating the tray section. So, when the carpet is placed on it like this, and the belts are fastened, the carpet won't slip off the craft while in flight. I see, said Douglas. So once the rockets are fired, the whole thing will simply take off and we'll have a flying carpet. But you can't call a carpet a flying carpet, but the only one reason it is flying is because it happens to be secured to something that is flying, said Montgomery Jones with a grin. No, I'm afraid a flying carpet must be able to fly by itself without the help of rockets. However, we are living in the real world, and here there's no such thing as a carpet that can become airborne by itself. So to make this carpet fly, it's going to need a little help. That is where this device comes into the picture. This is the plan. Firstly, the carpet is secured firmly to the craft, then the rockets are fired, and like I said, the craft is launched into the air, carpet and all. That includes myself, as I'll be holding on to the safety handles. Once the craft has reached a certain height, I'll pull this lever over here, explained Uncle Montgomery, pointing to the protruding gear-shift thingamy-bob, and the belts will instantly unfasten, disconnecting the craft and the carpet. And so, for a very brief period, I will be riding a flying carpet. Don't you mean a falling carpet? Oh, yes, it's quite correct, Daddy. But it doesn't matter, you see, because once I pull the lever and the carpet and I are separated from the craft, the carpet, having been propelled by the rockets, will be too lazy to stop and will continue to move before we're both pulled back to Earth by gravity. Thus, I will have created a flying carpet, albeit for a very short time. This sounds, all very interesting, Uncle, not to mention rather dangerous. What's it all for? I mean, I thought you were interested in finding the lost world of fantasy. So how are you going to do that by flying on a carpet for a few seconds? Especially when the carpet is flying in the real world and the mechanisms behind its flight can all be logically explained. Oh, you're a clever young man, exclaimed Uncle Montgomery. You're 100% correct. Under ordinary circumstances, you could say that I was barking up the wrong tree, since flying on a carpet in this way can be explained and cannot therefore have anything to do with the lost world of fantasy. But remember, Douglas, we are on top of a hill with remnants of that lost world of fantasy right here. So things are not as simple as they would be at any other place in the world. You see, one day, while reading in the castle, I stumbled upon a paragraph in an ancient book which made me terribly excited and spurred me on to conceive and assemble this invention. Montgomery Jones was trembling with excitement as he spoke. The paragraph I read told of an ancient law binding the world of fantasy and reality together. Yes, it's called absolutely out of the question rule. This law simply states that if any person belonging to the real world does something magical that defies logic, it's absolutely out of the question and thus should not exist in the real world. The paragraph went on to explain, however, that if such a situation did arise, the person who created the magic, as well as the magic itself, would be instantly sucked into the world of fantasy, where it could just freely exist. Oh, so you mean that if I actually invented a spell and used it to turn one of my teachers into a frog, and it worked, I'd be sucked into the world of fantasy? Douglas asked with a grin. Before you could say jumping jellyfish, explained his uncle with a laugh. But to continue with my story, after I finished reading the paragraph, I had an incredible idea. I realized that if I could do something that had totally defied logic and in effect was absolutely impossible for this world, I would be sucked into the world of fantasy and thus achieve my goals. Well, I racked my brains for many days and finally came up with a magic carpet plan. But you just said a moment ago that the magic carpet is not actually magical, exclaimed Douglas. But wait until you hear what I have in mind, nephew, replied the little man with a confident wag of the finger. You see, if I pull the lever and release the carpet and myself from the craft in such a way as to have the carpet fly over the house, then the magic of the house would be absorbed by the carpet, and after a brief instant it would seem as though I've created a magic flying carpet. I'm quite sure that as soon as this happens, I'll be instantly sucked into the world of fantasy. Wow, exclaimed Douglas, who by now had definitely caught some of his uncle's very contagious excitement. I mean, do you really think it will work? I really do, my boy, replied Montgomery Jones. Yes, I really do. If you do get sucked into the world of fantasy, how will you get back here? Inquired Douglas. Oh, easy as pie, replied his uncle. Since anything is possible in the world of fantasy, and I'm not really part of that world, I'll be able to return without hassle. I suppose that means I won't be able to go along with you, said Douglas, rather disappointed. Of course you will, replied the little man. The rule is very clear. By helping me with this project, in fact, by even being aware of it, you'll be considered as an accomplice of sorts, a contributor to the creation of the magical event. You'll then, that's to be sucked into the world of fantasy along with me. Oh, Uncle Monty, I hope it works, I really do, Douglas said excitedly. But what happens if it doesn't? How are you going to protect yourself against something, going awfully wrong? My word, what a worrywart you are, eh? Just like your mother. However, there's really no need for concern, because I'll be wearing gloves, goggles, a helmet, and a parachute, which I bought especially for the project. Everything will be just fine, you'll see. I have a very good feeling about the whole affair. Now, you just come along and help me take this contraption outside. Reassured by his uncle's confidence, Douglas did as he was told, and soon, with his uncle carrying the contraption and Douglas the carpet, the two arrived a little way down the hill, at a point where the weeds and wildflowers had been cleared away to make room for a concrete wedge. Embedded in this small, sloping, concrete platform were two parallel steel bars. These slid perfectly into grooves on the underside of the craft. So, when it had been moved into place, the rocket tray, with Persian carpet securely firmly pointing upwards, its rockets seemingly desperate to puncture the cloudless sky. Well, I think everything's in place now, yes, I'm absolutely sure. I've done all that's necessary, Montgomery Jones declared as he began to put on a large helmet, goggles, and a thick pair of black leather gloves. I have to say, I have never been quite so excited, he exclaimed, slinging a rather odd-looking backpack on his shoulder. I've done many things in my time, but if this works, it will definitely be my greatest achievement. It would be simply incredible, agreed Douglas. Will you just look at that, shouted Montgomery Jones, triumphantly pointing towards the tower. The weathercock has managed to put itself back on the top of the dome. Now there's magic in the morning air, I can tell you. Oh, yes, sirree. If this is not the right time, then, no time is it? Sure enough, Douglas discovered to his amazement the weathercock had returned to its perch on top of the dome and appeared just as lifeless as ever. Right, Dougie, yelled Montgomery Jones. Are you ready? Oh, ready when you are, Uncle Monty, replied Douglas. Excellent. Well then, stand clear. Here we go. With that, Montgomery Jones produced a box of matches and promptly lit the fuse protruding from each rocket. There was a loud hiss as the fuses began to burn, followed by a roar, a cloud of smoke, and a shower of sparks as the rockets ignited. Then, the rocket tray lurched skywards, with its inventor hanging on for dear life. From where Douglas stood, he was able to see the rocket tray as it soared higher and higher, just about reaching the height that was level with the tower. From there, it was supposed to curve like a rainbow and glide over the house. But this didn't happen, for suddenly the roaring of the rocket ceased, and with a feeble splutter, their fiery jets died out simultaneously. Douglas watched in shock and amazement as the craft, now without any propulsion, began to fall, spinning, somersaulting on its way down, utterly out of his uncle's control. Just then, as if waking from a trance, Montgomery Jones released his grip and pushed himself free of the rocket tray. A moment later, the backpack burst open, a large, bright red parachute unfolded above him. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a brave but futile attempt at saving himself from, an absolutely terrible fall, as Monty had almost reached the ground, and the parachute had not had sufficient time to slow down the speed of his descent. But these were, by no means normal circumstances. Just a second before Montgomery Jones was about to hit the ground and meet his end, Douglas, who had naturally been watching this all and expecting the worst, was flung to the ground by a powerful gust of wind which whirled upwards, filling his uncle's parachute and pushing it skyward, in the nick of time. Then it disappeared, leaving the parachute and its user to drift gently down to earth. Uncle Montgomery landed with a soft thump at the foot of the hill, quite near the postbox. His parachute landed on top of him. "Well, yes, a terrible flop, my boy, a terrible failure. What a disappointment, eh?" he exclaimed, once he had disentangled himself from the folds of the parachute. "And simply because of nothing but pure carelessness," he added, looking very forlornly at his nephew, who had run down to meet him. But things started off so incredibly well," said Douglas. "What on earth went wrong?" "That's the terrible thing," replied his uncle, now on the verge of tears. "Nothing was wrong with the craft at all. The fact is, I simply forgot to fill the rockets with fuel. And as a result, my serious oversight, the project is now totally ruined. What's more, if it hadn't been for the wind, which I was able to summon in the nick of time, I don't think I'd be around to talk to you at this moment." "But I saw smoke and flames, and you flew off into the sky. How on earth could this have been possible without fuel in the rockets?" That wasn't fuel," replied Montgomery Jones. "That was a mixture of highly concentrated faith and enthusiasm, probably the most powerful combinations that exists. I've always maintained that a person who finds a way to bottle faith and enthusiasm will solve the world's energy demands. However, my faith and enthusiasm for the project died quickly enough when I suddenly remembered at the precise moment I'd attained the height of the tower that I'd forgotten the fuel. Well, you know what happened after that. And now look at it, my boy," sighed Montgomery Jones as he glanced at his invention, which now lay just torn and mangled nearby. All my hard work and effort is just wasted, without ever knowing if it could have worked. What a shame, eh? Just what a shame." Then, turning and giving Douglas a sad smile, he said, "Come on. I could certainly do with a nice cup of tea." "Well, try not to feel too bad about it, Uncle Monty," said Douglas, in an attempt to console his uncle. "I mean, if you could have only seen the way that invention of yours flew off into the air, why, it was, it was simply amazing." "Yes, darn right it was," Uncle Montgomery exclaimed with a chuckle. "I bet there's been nothing like it before." "And of course," added Douglas, "I'm sure, no matter how bad it looks, you'll be able to repair it in no time. And with fuel in these rockets next time around, I'm sure you'll succeed." Yes, I probably would," replied his uncle. "But I'm afraid it would take too long, and I have to rebuild the craft almost entirely. By that time, your stay would have come to an end, and you would have missed out on the adventure. I would have broken my promise. Of all these things I really hate, breaking promises is at the top of the list. No, I'm afraid, it's back. It's back to the drawing board, that means, back to the library. I have to find some other way of getting into the world of fantasy, and you're going to help me, Dougie. We'll make a joint effort, and things will work out. Yes, I'm quite sure they will."